Believers, in this recording, I'm going to talk about cold cases. I've spoken about cold cases before, so it's not really something new, but I want to highlight the following. There is no such thing as a cold case. Now you may say, Rashid, you first just say you're going to talk about cold cases, and now you say there is no such thing as a cold case. I'm not contradicting myself, just hear me out. The term, or the label cold case exists. They use it in the legal system to refer to homicide cases, or criminal cases, whether it's a homicide or kidnapping, or you can say someone went missing. Anyway, so there's a criminal case that has not been resolved. Or in other way, they have not found a perpetrator and sentenced the perpetrator. Now, there are two assumptions here. First, that a crime has been committed. Now, in the case of homicide, it's obvious it was a crime. In the case of a missing person, it's likely there is a crime. And there's another assumption, that is that it's only resolved when a perpetrator is sentenced by the legal system. If that's still possible, if the perpetrator is still alive. Now, I want to point out the following. Crime happens. We know that. So we're not going to discuss that. It's obvious crime happens. But why does crime happen? Some say, well, Rashid, some people are just greedy, they want to take advantage of the opportunity. That's what people on the right wing would say. People on the left wing would say, well, people commit crime but just to survive. But here's the thing. It is true that sometimes people commit crime just to survive. Okay? For example, if you have someone who stabbed someone who tried to kill him, let's say you have a guy and he's about to be attacked by someone and he uses a weapon to defend himself. In this case, he ended up killing the other individual, not because he intended to, but because other individual tried to kill him. So now he committed a crime, you can say, but it was out of necessity. Okay? In such cases called self-defense, and you're not charged for murder nor manslaughter. Then you have people who break into homes just because they are upset that someone else has a leverage, they want to take away something from someone. So there are various motives for crime. This video is not about the motives for crime. You can talk to a criminologist about it. As a sociologist and an anthropologist, I know the motivations of crime and the dynamics that are involved in it, but I'm not going to focus on that per se. I want to focus on something that's often not talked about. And that is that cold cases, well, that label cold case is really misleading. Because what is a warm case? If there's a cold case, there must be a warm case or a hot case. Now, they call it a cold case because time has passed. Just like when you put some fresh coffee, it's hot or warm, and after an hour or two, it's cold. So that's how they compare it, a cold case. But here's the thing. When is a criminal case, declared cold? When some time has passed, likely 2 or 3 years. So that shows you that folks are only interested in solving the matter if there's a reward in it. Why is it after 3 years called a cold case? So that shows you that, one, the legal system is limited in the resources, so they cannot focus on every case all the time. So that shows you that they can't provide justice because you don't have the means to do so. First thing first, they can't even resurrect people. So if someone has been murdered, they can't give life back to the individual, so actual justice they can never give. Neither can they offer solutions because they're limited in their scope. They can arrest people and imprison them or execute them, but that's all they can do. So, cold cases. They use that label to refer to cases they don't want to be solved. Oh yes. I've given you the context of the term or the label cold case so you can understand the context of what's going on. Cold cases are criminal cases that the population doesn't want resolved. Now you may ask, Rashid, why wouldn't people want a case to be resolved? Let's say young lady, 20 years old, a student, went missing. And she's been missing for 20 years. And it's become a cold case because almost 2 decades passed by. And after 2 decades, suddenly the case is solved. They identify a body at some ranch as hers. And they discover that it was her ex-boyfriend that killed her, and his relatives buried her so that the ex-boyfriend wouldn't go to jail. Okay? Now, let's say such a case happens, because there are similar cases like that. A female in her 20s, a student, in the spring of her life, she goes missing. What's the first thing you would ask? Did she have conflict with someone? Did someone intended harm on her? And if you want to look who intended harm on her, you would look at the people closest to her. Namely, did she have a sex partner? Oh yes, she had several. Oh, maybe one of those sex partners may know something about it. So let's check their alibis. So, if you look at the case, you realize, hold on a minute. The police didn't really make any effort to figure out what happened to this woman. And she also realized that the community also didn't bother that much with it. So then you're going to realize, well, hold on a minute. Anytime anyone goes missing, this is a standard procedure the police follows. And this has been the case since the 19th century. And even in the 19th century, when you had no DNA test, you had no surveillance cameras, you had no instant communication. Even in those days, they managed to solve cases, often very quickly and with precision. So how come that later in history, when people had more technology available to them, a woman 20 years old goes missing, and police fails to apply the standard procedure, which is very easy? And now you're going to think, why didn't anyone around at the time ask the police why they didn't do their job? Because if the public begins to talk about it, the police is under pressure to perform their job. So then you realize, well, hold on a minute. So this woman that went missing, she was really missed by people. Okay, so she was really missed. Why wasn't she missed by people? And then you figure out, when you talk to an old classmate of hers, who's now in her 40s, that classmate of her would tell her, let's say your name is Jack and you are a journalist. The former classmate would tell you, Jack, this Lisa that went missing, she was popular in high school, but let me tell you, she had an attitude of putting people in their place. She wouldn't take crap from anyone, not even her own parents. And this attitude that she wouldn't take any form of dumping from anyone, even though it was correct, she put people in their place, but people couldn't stand it. Even many of the teachers wish harm on her because they felt humiliated that she, a teenager, put them in their place. And then you realize, so a lot of people wish harm on this woman because this woman pointed out their darkness. And then you talk to a guy in his 70s who used to be a supervisor at the job that this woman had, and he tells you, Jack, this Lisa, this woman that went missing, I can remember that one day she was at work and she left, and all the people after she left began to murmur and complain about her, how much she couldn't stand her. And people were losing their minds. Even some of the customers that walked into the shop suddenly left when they saw her. And you think, whoa. And the guy tells you, Jack, the moment I heard she was missing, I knew someone got her. I thought it was one of her ex-boyfriends, because she has like 4 ex-boyfriends, so I thought it was one of them. Or I thought it was maybe one of those teachers at school, but I knew someone got to her. And here's the thing, Jack. The police around, because we were a small city, the police knew that she wasn't that beloved. So the police knew that people were relieved that she was gone. So the police knew that people were not interested in the case being solved. Because if the case would be solved and the perpetrator will be brought to justice, then the population has something to explain. Then the people will have to explain the negative attitude towards her. She did not cause harm to anyone. She was just firm that she doesn't take any maltreatment from anyone. So why were people so bitter at her? Because they were stupid, and because people didn't want to face themselves, and because people couldn't openly dump on her because that would mean they would embarrass themselves. That's why a lot of people were meditating negatively on her. And if they would catch a perpetrator, the perpetrator would be able to point out the violence of the whole community. And once the violence of the community would be addressed, now the community has to answer, and they can't answer it. So then people are going to deny it. People want to play the victim. And here's the thing about people, Jack. When they can't escape a situation, they will escalate within the situation. So what would happen then is that if they catch a perpetrator and the perpetrator points out the violence of the community and the community can't answer it, what's going to happen? People will begin to dump their negativity on one another. And there's going to be an increase in domestic violence, and likely there will be more homicides. So the police, as well as the courthouses, they understood that if they solved this case, it would not be beneficial for this community. It would only lead to more trouble and more harm and more violence. So that's why 2 years later, I never told anyone this, I found out that the chief officer that presided over the case was told by the governor to leave the case alone. And he did. Now, 20 years later, those young people, those peers of Lisa, are now in their 40s. They have their own families. Many of the older people that couldn't stand Lisa have passed away. So now, if the case is resolved, now the damage will be less. The guy, the ex-boyfriend, was arrested and he's being charged. He's going to face 20 years in prison. Hey, his family is now in shock, but at least the community is spared. So when that guy explained all this to Jack, Jack was saying, aha, I get it now. So understand the following, believer. A cold case is a case that for political reasons people don't want it to be solved. Because, look, you can go on YouTube or on Vimeo or on some other video site and you can check cold cases. Now, many of those crime documentaries are like 30, 40 minutes, but they're also shortened versions of 10 to 12 minutes you can watch. So I recommend you to watch those. And when you check many of those cold cases, there are even YouTubers online who just examine cold cases. They're not medical professionals, they're not police officers, nor are they people with criminology degrees or sociology degrees, but they're just random people online that made it their hobby to examine cold cases. So whether you watch a documentary that's compiled by professionals, or it's just videos by random amateur investigators, one thing you will notice about cold cases is that when you look back on the case, you will realize that the investigation was poorly executed. And you realize that this weak investigation is too weak. It can be that a small error is committed in an investigation, but there are too many errors in this investigation. So when you reflect on the case and realize that the investigation was executed too poorly, then you know that it's a political thing that goes on. Because understand the following. Worldlings want to flee stuff. Worldlings want to deal with stuff. Worldlings don't want to face anything. But worldlings do want things to work out for them. So worldlings, in this case, they are narcissistic and delusional. And because they're narcissistic and delusional, they do not want to be confronted with the bad stuff in their communities. They don't. Those bad stuff are there, and they are the result of them fleeing, but they don't want to be confronted with this. So whenever a crime happens, it will disrupt the equilibrium, or you could say the ease of commoners. And when the ease of commoners is disrupted, people tend to escalate. Because now they need to deal that something bad happened. And worldlings don't want to do that. So If, for example, a little boy is murdered, there's a child that's been victimized. Now they cannot say, well, the child brought it on himself. But if it's a child, especially a young child, like 4 or 5 years old, they can never blame it on the child. So now they have to face the fact there's something bad in the community. If it takes a while before they find the perpetrator, the people become so anxious that they begin to project bad motives to one another, and that will ruin the atmosphere in that town. And once the atmosphere is ruined, physical altercations of violence will occur. So that's why there are times when the courthouses put the blame on someone who didn't commit the crime, and so that individual is sentenced to prison, or sometimes even executed. There were people executed for things they didn't do. And sometimes it was even evident that they didn't do it, but the people knew if we don't dump the blame on someone now, the community will fall apart. Or someone may be in prison, and later people figure out that, hold on a minute, there's no actual evidence to have this guy in jail. I mentioned this example before. I just don't know the name of the one it refers to anymore, but there was this guy in the United States, I believe he's an Afro-American. He was jailed for a rape that happened when he was out of town. So he was out of town. So he wasn't physically in the town, so he couldn't have raped that woman. And he was sentenced based on eyewitness accounts that were not correct because he wasn't even in town. It was proven he was out of town, but yet he was already convicted and in jail. So when the evidence was brought forth, what should have happened was that the High Court of that US state had to overturn the conviction. They did not do it. And here's the thing. Till this day, this guy is in prison. And there was a similar case where someone was murdered and the guy wasn't even in town, but he's still in jail. And they even told him, he's in prison, I mean. They even told him, get this deal, plead guilty, you only get 5 years, and then you'll be out. And the guy would say, I'm not going to plead guilty to a murder I did not commit. And nowhere do you plead guilty for murder and you get only 5 years, so he didn't trust it. He spent 20 more years behind bars, even though everyone knew he was innocent. Why do such things happen? Because of political reasons. Look, it can be, as an exception, that a crime happens, and due to the complexity of the case, people can't move further. That is, if the investigators don't have enough resources and all of that. That can happen from time to time. But cold cases are a phenomenon. They happen way too often. And why do they happen way too often? It's not because they don't have the proper resources to conduct all the research, because the prisons are full. They have the resources to deal with drug-related offenses very well, but why don't they have the resources to deal with certain homicides and certain missing persons? It is because there is some political interest in keeping it unsolved. Look, if let's say now, you grew up in a town and you always looked up to your parents as respectful people. And one day, there's this guy that appears and he tells the people around the dirt your parents did to him when they were younger. And you find out those dirty things about your parents. And once you figure those things out about your parents, you also realize that your parents lied to you. Then you begin to ask, what else have your parents lied about? So once you're exposed to the truth about your parents, can you go back to perceive your parents how you used to? Will you feel the same about your parents as you used to before? No. Now you realize that your parents are narcissistic, and they may even lie about you or sell you out when things get too hard on them. And now that this information has been revealed to you, you now reflect on your own childhood and you realize that there were times your parents gaslighted you. And I realize, what? So things about your own parents that your memory repressed are now coming out. So it can even lead to you thinking, I don't want to deal with my parents anymore. And what's going to happen then? The cohesion within the family decreases. So your parents have an interest in keeping their dirt hidden from you. Okay? And that implies that their victims need to either shut up or be silenced. Now, that's just one example. Let's say now that in a whole community, there's a lot of dirt people don't want to deal with. That means that the victims of the dirt either need to be silenced or they need to shut up. One of the two. And that is why there are so many cold cases. There are stuff that the people don't want to face about their communities. And that's why pagan courthouses worldwide have the following rule. If prosecuting a case is going to lead to too much conflict and trouble in society, they will dismiss the case. It doesn't matter what the case is, whether it's a fraud case, whether it's a homicide case, it's a sexual offense case, whatever the case is. If the case will bring too much controversy, they will drop it. And that is what a controversy is. A controversy is a conflict that cannot be resolved. Why? Because a controversy is a conflict in which people want something that cannot happen. For example, if in a society there's a minority, let's say an Asian minority, and the Asian minority has been victimized severely by that group, and now one of those people from that Asian minority one day lost his mind and he escalated and killed some tourists. 10 tourists were killed. He stabbed many people. It's a very big escalation. Now, the community has something to explain. How come this guy lost his mind like that? Then the community would say, well, look at the Asian minority. They have a lot of issues going on. But then people say, okay, but the Asian minority lives within your borders, right? How come they have so many issues and you guys don't know anything about it? If they're a minority and you guys are the majority, that means that you as a majority have the leverage. So why didn't you guys use your leverage to deal with what's going on with the minority? It's in your society, right? So now people will likely say, well, the guy was mentally ill, or there's an exception. People try to cover it up because now the neglect will be exposed. And here's another thing. There are many other things that happens with the majority that don't add up. And the reason why people in that society get along is because everyone avoids stuff. That's how worldlings get along, by fleeing. In order to flee, that means that they need some distraction so people don't see their narcissistic attitude. So every society works like this. Adults want to flee, so adults need to have a distraction, so people are focused on the distraction, so nobody will notice them. For example, it can be that you have a youth gang that is robbing many shops around. And everyone's so upset with the youth gang. They demonize this youth gang. But now you look at the bigger picture and think, okay, but this youth gang consists out of young people, right? Teenagers. Where do teenagers come from? Oh, they're born in the community. Okay, who are their parents? Oh, the parents are in the community. Oh, are the parents together? No. Did the relatives of those boys pick them up? No. Or some say, well, they're from foster homes. Oh, foster homes. So people had children, but they didn't want any responsibility, so they dumped them at the foster home. Okay? At a foster house, I mean. So you realize that, okay, so there are children being neglected over here. And as human beings, they have an inherent need to belong somewhere. They want to belong to the community, but you guys reject them. So they found an alternative community to belong to. And in this alternative community, they're taken advantage of. And because they are rejected by the community, when they want to get a job and economically contribute, they can't do it. So either they die of hunger, or they survive through alternative activities. And that's what they're doing. So you see now that gang over there is a type of survival mechanism of the young people that are rejected by the community. So if the community doesn't want that gang to exist, why don't they just give up the narcissistic attitude and face the fact that things don't work well in their community and learn to embrace the people that are harmed. Because those broken families are only there because the community allows it. If it happens in a community that a lot of men just want to have sex and don't want to stay with a woman if a woman becomes pregnant, the community has measures to deal with such men, and if they deal with those men properly and sternly, eventually men will not even think about sleeping with a woman without considering the consequences. So the fact that it happens so often, that you have so many fatherless homes and so many broken families, is because the community enables it. So the trauma is enabled by the community. So when the trauma escalates into harm, the community that enabled the trauma is responsible. But now they want to blame it all on the youth gang. Why? Because if you blame it all on the youth gang is in the spotlight, nobody notices their BS, that they just want to flee. That is why whenever something happens that reveals the elephant in the room, the local authorities will just cover it up. Cold cases are political cover-ups to prevent a community from falling apart. That is what it's about. Because I'm telling you, if the local authorities would solve every crime that goes on, you wouldn't have a community anymore. People wouldn't feel comfortable being part of society anymore. People wouldn't feel comfortable trusting their fellow men. Because 99% of the time, when someone is a victim of a crime, the crime is committed by someone they know or someone close to them. Now, there are exceptions. You walk on the street and someone suddenly jumps on you to take your wallet. Such things happen. But when it comes to crime in general, most of the time it's committed by people you know or people close to you. But what's the thing about society? Society is all about avoidance. Society is all about friends and family first. So if people realize that it's common that those same people, friends and family, are the ones that will harm you, then they will not invest in this thing called society. And if they don't do it, you're going to have a bunch of adults that have to deal with one another, and they're all awkward because they don't want to do it. And that's going to lead to a very uncomfortable climate. And in this uncomfortable climate, violence will likely occur very easily. So, to keep the environment safe, you need worldlings to get along. And for them to get along, you need to give them some outlet to flee. That's why when they're fleeing, turns into escalation. And if the escalation will reveal too much about the narcissistic attitude of the community, they will cover it up. They can't cover up all crime. That's not feasible. But if a crime is so sensitive that it will expose the community for what it is, they will censor it. They will. Maybe you know of a case where that was the case. Or maybe you had a relative or a friend or a colleague or whoever you knew that was killed or that vanished, and till this day, so-called nobody knows what happens. Now you know what's going on. Most people know exactly what happened, but they just don't want it to be revealed because it will be too costly. So understand this. When a cold case has been labeled a cold case, anyone that mentions it may be in trouble. There are some crimes that happen in a community. If you as an outsider come and you mention it, people will even become upset with you and even turn on you. Why? Because the ease of that environment depends on people denying what happened. And here's the thing, if you are the victim of some collective neglect and you survive, people don't want you around. Why? Because you've become the controversial figure. Let me explain. If the victim of collective neglect dies, then everyone can cover up the blame of the community by putting all on the direct perpetrator. But if the victim survives, now the victim is able to see the neglect of the community. Or even if the victim doesn't see it, others will reflect on the case to think, but why didn't the community do anything about it? Okay? So, when the neglect is exposed of the community, there's trouble. And none of the people in that community benefits from their narcissism being exposed. So when you are the survivor of collective neglect, people will turn on you. they don't want you around. They'll be upset that you've survived. They'll even wish harm on you or hope that you die or pass away. Why? Because then they don't have to face themselves. So, when you survive neglect of the community, don't be surprised when people turn on you. Don't be surprised if you're not invited on birthday parties or people always seek to put dirt on your name. Why? Because your survival is a testimony against them. And here's another thing. If people dumped on you, they went way too far against you, and now they have to face themselves, sometimes people try to hoover you, try to blackmail you into forgetting everything they did to you just because they don't want to face consequences. And look, if you're someone realistic like I am, that you make plain to people, no, you need to take responsibility for your neglect. You're not going to put it all on me because it wasn't all on me. Now people are going to call you a narcissist. Now people are going to escalate against you because now you force them to face themselves. And I want to close this audio recording with the following. If you have anyone close to you, whether it's a parent or maybe a child or another relative, or maybe just someone that lives in a neighborhood that contributed to neglect towards you, and they refuse, flat out refuse to take responsibility and to become better people, they refuse to change their attitude and their behaviors. They refuse to change their way of thinking. They refuse to improve. They refuse to become safer people, because people that neglect are not safe to be around. If they persist in denial, that means they also persist in incriminating you, even though you obviously were the victim over there. If they do that, straight up disassociate from such people. If it's a parent, lower contact and stay away from that individual. If it's a grown child of yours, then do the same thing. If it's the whole community that agrees to not address the issue, move out of that place. Hey, let me repeat the last part. If it's the whole community that knows what happened to you and they didn't do anything at all to make things up to you, nor to deal with the perpetrators, what do? Move out of that community. Because you survived it, that means you are evidence against them. So sooner or later, they'll want to get rid of the evidence, and they will look for some creep to do the dirty job for them. A lot of people survived neglect by the community, and later that same community killed them just so the community doesn't have to face themselves. And most of the time, when that happens, that you survive neglect of the community and you're killed, it's mostly then that they label it a cold case. It's then that people don't want people to figure it out, at least not for the next few decades. So, learn how the world really works and anticipate its violence. Be at peace.